Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I am back again today with another video idea, and today I am going to be casting my ideal cast for a season of Survivor New School versus Old School. So this idea has been tossed around a lot as a potential season, basically taking a ton of people who play in the New School idea of Survivor, the era of tons of idols and advantages and rapid-paced gameplay, versus old school Survivor, which is considered much more reliant on the social game, much more about creating strong bonds which lead into alliances, but really just relying heavily on social dynamics and um, having strong connections over finding advantages and idols. So without further ado, let's get into it. So starting with New School, my first player is Ryan from Heroes, Healers, and Hustlers. I think he uh, I think he brings a good dynamic to this season in that he kind of represents the style of player who's kind of the Cochran-esque player, I guess you'd say, who's kind of smaller, a little bit more nerdy, you might say, kind of scheming, and I think he found some advantages in his season. He had some good alliances, but also was willing at any time to kind of like bail and do what was best for him. I think as far as who he reminds me of, he sort of reminds me of a combination of like Adam Klein and Cochran, I guess, if I had to think of some comparisons for him, and a guy who I think it'd be interesting to see him back on another season and what he would do in a season without somebody so domineering like Ben just kind of steamrolling him in the game. Next, I have Domenick from Ghost Island. I think another guy who really well represents modern Survivor of being a dominant force and using advantages and idols to your benefit. He did have a few idols this season that he was on. Obviously, a very forceful player, a very strong competitor, one of the best players we've ever seen to not win the game. So I think that he would be a welcomed addition to the new school tribe for uh, new school versus old school. Next, Chris Underwood, who I think is like the definition of new school survivor, winning or I don't know about winning, but playing a very successful game with a lot of advantages and kind of like modern loopholes to the game. And I think, yeah, I don't think you could have like a new school versus old school without having Chris in here because Chris's game was like almost exclusively reliant on twists and various advantages. So I think you gotta have him on a new school versus old school season. Zeke Smith. I think that Survivor loves this guy. They'd have him back on any season that he wanted to come back on. I think he's. I think my only concern for him is he's going to become too overused too quickly. Like you'll see that they had him play, I believe, back-to-back seasons, 33 and 34, Millennials versus Gen X and Game Changers, and um, you know, I think if this season were a little bit down the road, he'd be an ideal candidate. I don't know if it was like next season, it might be a little too quick because he will have then played like 3 seasons of Survivor in 4 years, which is a lot. Um, but he, I think he really represents the kind of strategic new school Survivor of like voting in blocks and kind of not really having alliances, but like just finding the right people for every single vote and like coming up with the right people just for one vote and basically the strategy just going at 100 miles an hour. I think he is an ideal representative of that kind of a gameplay. Next, Dean Kowalski, who was on season 39, Island of the Idols. I think he is a guy who worked with a lot of advantages when he played. His game was heavily reliant on like idols and finding different twists and things like that in the game. And Island of the Idols as a season as a whole was kind of very twist and advantage reliant. So I think like somebody from that season would be a good representative for New School, and I think Dean is kind of the ideal candidate. Um, I think he's interesting enough and likable enough that we'd want him back for another season, and I think he's also very fun and compelling. Like he's got some charisma to him actually, even though he's kind of this goofy dude. Next, Chrissy Hofbeck from Heroes, Healers, and Hustlers. I think that we just need another season of Chrissy, and I think she really represented to me kind of that mom archetype that's always been on Survivor, but how you can be that mom archetype in the modern Survivor and be pretty dominant. And I think that's what Chrissy was on her season. And so, yeah, I'd really love to see her back and see what she can do again. Her game was very all over the place in season 35, so I'd love to see how she'd play on another season. Next for the new school tribe, I have Allie from Heroes, Healers, and Hustlers. Another person who I kind of just considered like a second chance effort, and I think that she's a person who went out of the game relatively early compared to when most people thought she would leave the game, but she seemed like she had a lot to her, kind of like a Michaela, where she left the game pretty early but seemed like she had a lot of potential, and we didn't really get to see much of it, so I'd love to see her represented on another season, and I think new school versus old school would be a very appropriate place for her to be slotted. Next, Hannah Shapiro. I think similar to Zeke, she would be an ideal candidate in that she's very representative of the whole modern strategic side of Survivor, where like plans can come together in like a couple of minutes in showtime. Um, which what I mean is like in the equivalent of watching the episode, like a whole plan can develop in like 2 minutes, but like in the course of actual Survivor, it's like an hour probably on the island, but just a very fast-paced game, and I think she's very representative of that, which is representative of New School Survivor. So I think she'd be a good choice. And then next, Natalie Anderson, who is kind of just an all-around great player, very compelling, and I think would be really good for any modern season. Um, she, of course, is on Winners at War, which is a season with some twists and turns, and she adapted to them super well, probably the best of anybody. So I think that she is very equipped to play in an advantage heavy kind of new school framework and be a representative of that. So yeah, Natalie is another choice here. Carolyn Rivera from Worlds Apart, a person who really just needs a second shot at Survivor, and I think deserves to be representing the game once more. And I think she's again sort of like Chrissy, like kind of this motherly archetype, but in a new school setting. And she did very well in the new school setting and in the fast-paced world. So I think she'd be a good person to have on to represent the new school tribe. Now going to the old school tribe, I think Lex is a great person to have on. I think he, from Africa and All Stars, was one of the most interesting early survivors there was. I think he played a very good game in Africa. Obviously, played a little bit shabbier of a game in All Stars, but overall, huge personality. Got by on his relationships with other people, along with being a pretty good challenge guy. So I think he would be like a must for old school. Um, yeah, and Africa is one of probably my favorite old school seasons, so to speak. So you might see a lot of Africa represented on here, but I think it's a great representation of what old school really meant. Speaking of the devil, I have Kelly Goldsmith on here from Africa. I think a player who at the time actually had quite a bit of talk about her coming back and playing again. She was pretty mouthy. Um, Obviously, she wasn't in the dominant alliance on her season, so she was never going to win Africa, but she was a pretty distinct character on that season, wherein she kind of had a feud with Lex for a little while. She kind of had a feud with some of the dominant forces in the game, and so her days were numbered because of that. But I think it'd be interesting to see how she would fare on a second go round. Um, and not necessarily like a winner pick necessarily, but just an interesting character to have on. Of course, you can't have old school without T-Bird. Teresa T-Bird, as most people know her as, she is one of the bar none most likable Survivor characters ever. On her season, probably the most likable character. Her and Ethan were probably the two most likable people. Everybody on that season says if she would have gotten to the end, she would have won. Um, she is just so fun and nice, and I would love to see her back. A person who really got far in the game. She was had some strategy to her, but really just on forming really good relationships with people, and that's what old school is all about. It's about forming strong bonds and getting far in the game based on that, and she's a perfect representative of that. Next, I have Amy Cusack, who was on both Vanuatu and Fans versus Favorites. Um, you know, did pretty well on Vanuatu, did pretty poorly on Fans versus Favorites. I think that she kind of had a rough go on Fans versus Favorites, got screwed with the tribe swap, and really deserves another chance because I don't think we saw enough out of her in that season. Um, Again, another person who really succeeded at Survivor just from being very persuasive and charismatic with her tribe mates and being able to sway people. And actually, kind of one of our first old school villains that we ever got on the show, and villainesses. I think if she wasn't on Fans versus Favorites, there would have been a good shot she would have been on Heroes versus Villains. And I think that I actually saw her on Fans versus Favorites before Vanuatu, and so seeing her on Vanuatu after Fans and Favorites was really interesting in that I got to see a lot more of what she's capable of, and I'd love to see her another time out on the show. Next, also from Vanuatu, Twila. Um, Twila is just super funny and a huge character, and not that she would necessarily add a ton of strategy or great social gameplay, but I think on any given season you just need kind of a few quirky nuts to have in the bunch, and I think she would be that on this season. And being frank, she'd probably go pretty early on on the old school tribe, but um, I just found her very funny on her season, so I would bring her back. Next, Vecepia, who is a very likable, strong force, as we all know from her season in Marquesas, really represents how a lot like T-Bird, having really good social bonds and being a very nice, likable person will get you very far and lead to a lot of success in the game. And she was like the perfect um, encompassment of that. I don't know if encompassment is a word, but she perfectly encompassed it, I should say. And yeah, I'd love to see her come back as she's never competed a second time, and a lot of people thought she should have. Um, Next, Ian Rosenberger, who was on Palau, a guy who, as a lot of people know, came very close to winning, and basically, um, he technically didn't quit the show, but he essentially gave up in a situation where he knew it would lead to him getting directly voted off. Um, so I think that we really need to see another go of Ian. He represented how you can be a very dominant force just from challenges and alliances, and so I'd love to see him come back. Rafe from Guatemala, who is a forgotten about player because Guatemala is kind of a shunned season in the Survivor community for somewhat unknown reasons, honestly. Um, Guatemala was a very harsh season in that the conditions, like the weather and the climate, were very hard for the competitors. Rafe played probably the best game actually of anybody on the season, but just because of circumstances out of his control, obviously would need a second chance because he didn't win his season. Um, Very much represented old school, I think, though, of just being very likable, being situated in a good alliance, and getting far based on your personality and your bonds. So, again, I'd love to see Rafe on a second time. Next, I have Dreamz, which is sort of a goofy addition to this cast. But sort of like Twila, I think you need some characters on your season, and I think Dreamz is one of the goofiest characters to ever come through Survivor. Probably one of the most blissfully unaware players of Survivor ever, as far as how he was coming off to others around him. Um, but weirdly enough, had some good success. Propelled himself pretty far into the game. Um, so I think I would not know what to expect from Dreamz the second time. He's actually a pretty physical player and pretty dominant physically, so he'd actually probably still fare relatively decent on a second season. But I'd love to see what he would do a second time around. And then of course Earl Cole perfectly embodies domination of a season, but also doing it very under the radar, very quietly, very much through social gameplay and just being very um, relaxed in his gameplay. He's basically come as close as you can to being the perfect survivor on a given season, and I just think that this guy doesn't get enough shine and should definitely be on a second season. And that is it, guys. That is my cast for Survivor New School versus Old School. Let me know your thoughts in the comments on who should be cast in a season such as that, and I will see you next time. Bye.